He said we would basically control Gaza. You got to have some level of cojones to say the things that others aren't willing to say, to bring people to the table in complex ways. And so, I mean, for God's sake, the Taliban is still in charge, $80 billion and 2 decades later. What did you make of when he said, I mean, he really threw him there. He said we would basically control Gaza and occupy it. It caught some folks by surprise there. I would say that, first of all, just on the pause of foreign dignitaries coming in the way that they are, I think that he's commanding respect again. I mean, I do not think the rest of these world leaders had an iota of respect for Biden as the president. They had a respect for the office of the president, but I don't think they fundamentally respected the man who occupied it, largely because people have been in rooms with him, even business leaders who have gone to the White House in late Biden's tenure have told me the same thing. He's just not there, right? You and I are having a conversation as two thinking human beings, examining one another's thoughts. That wasn't something that happened for people who met with Biden in the White House. And I don't mean to rag on the guy. I in some ways feel bad for any person of older age who's past their peak of mental acuity and is suffering from it. But that was the state of affairs. Now you got a guy who is with it, who brings the energy, who has the spine and the resolve and the force of muscle to be able to actually engage with independent ideas and negotiate in the backdrop of those ideas. So, Donald Trump is a master conversation starter. He is a master negotiator, and he's a master at using a start of a conversation to enter a negotiation. Look at what happened even in the discussions in recent days with Mexico, Canada, and China. Well, he brought Mexico and Canada to the table, and now the real focus shifts to what the heck we're going to do in our relationship with China, which is in a different category from Mexico and Canada. China's in a different category because we can't depend on China for our modern way of life. You got most of the semiconductors in the U.S. Department of Defense being supplied by China. Our defense industrial base depends on China. Our pharmaceutical supply chain depends on China. So it's not just a trade question. It's a question of actual national security, actually, in a true sense. You can't depend on an adversary for things that are essential to your existence. But look at the masterful way he backed into that, right? He started with, want to talk about Canada, talk about Mexico, get him to the table, conversation starters that were, you could call them aggressive openers of conversation. But he's a guy who is able to start a conversation that otherwise would not be had. I love that he met in person with Gavin Newsom. Great. You can trade barbs with the guy, but push comes to shove on issues that relate to America. If Gavin's going to be talking to him in good faith about it, Donald Trump will have that conversation. And then Bibi comes here. He has a conversation, and he, akin to a lot of his other conversation openers, started a conversation by lighting a fire that otherwise sparks a conversation. Okay, what does the future actually look like? Like, let's talk about amongst serious ideas of how we're going to make sure the United States' interests are protected in ways that don't drag us into protracted conflicts in the Middle East. I mean, Donald Trump was the OG in the Republican Party for that. He was an opponent to the Iraq War before that was a cool thing to say for a Republican politician. I think he's a guy who knows what he's doing. I think he's a pragmatist who understands America's interests deeply. And I think that you got to let him work it in his method in order to get there, even if every one of the, initial conversation starters isn't necessarily the literal way that he's actually going to ultimately do it.
Do you think we should control Gaza?
Well, look, I think that let's just take a broader question about U.S. Middle East policy. I don't think our track record, I think I'm going to say is super controversial here, I think is kind of obvious. I don't think our track record of being a nation-building operator in the Middle East has been very good, or we wouldn't be where we are in Iraq and Afghanistan right now. Mm-hmm. I mean, for God's sake, the Taliban is still in charge, $80 billion and 2 decades later. It wasn't a nation-building project that worked. I don't think that Iraq was, compared to the amount of money and even more importantly than money, the lives that were sacrificed, I don't think achieved our objectives there. And by the way, I fully, being in the room with one of them, fully respect the patriots who served our country when our country called for their service. And I think there were valuable objectives to have been achieved in a narrow way, certainly in Afghanistan. And you could talk about other missions elsewhere. But I think by and large, our track record of engaging in straight up nation building has historically in the Middle East not been all that successful. What I'm going to say here is I'm going to give President Trump the space to know that he's a man who has a strategy when he says something. In the long run, he has an idea of where he's going. And he is somebody who has proven time and again that he's able to use the contours of conversation and negotiation to achieve what others would have previously deemed impossible. I mean, I think what he did even in the Middle East last time around with the Abraham Accords was unthinkable. It was unthinkable at the time he took office. And you're not just going to get there by some linear path with, bushy tail showing up and saying, okay, well, here's what I want to do. And I'm going to tell you exactly what that is. And somehow everyone's going to magically agree with me. No, it doesn't work that way. You got to have some level of cojones to say the things that others aren't willing to say, to bring people to the table in complex ways. And so I'm going to let him do his job as the commander in chief to lead us effectively. He's demonstrated time and again that he knows what he's doing. Obviously, he knows as well as anybody what our historical track record in, occupation and nation building in the Middle East has been in the past, because he was the guy who called that to the forefront of the Republican Party. And I think he knows what he's doing when it comes to mapping out how we're going to secure America in the future, which is his top objective.
Let's talk about DOGE.
Sure.
Department of Government Efficiency.
Yes,
So
love it.
you're a big part of that.
Yeah.
And then what happened?
Yeah, I mean, look, I've been talking about this for years. I mean, tackling the administrative state has been my longtime passion. And Elon and I actually met first when I ran for president at a dinner where this is exactly the topic we spent hours into 1 a.m. talking about, was the basis of our friendship ever since. First objective is get Donald Trump elected. After he got elected, the question is, for me personally, how am I going to have my impact on the country? That was the issue that I had been so focused on. Wrote a book even recently laying out the roadmap of one way I thought a lot of this could get done, taking a legal and constitutional law first approach and legislation to be able to cut budgets in a lasting way, to be able to do it in a way that used the law and the lawmaking process and recent Supreme Court precedents. And so that was a vision I've been articulating for a long time. And, even spoke about that shortly after DOGE was announced, and the op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that Elon and I co-published there, lay that out. Now, something like DOGE has never happened before, and it's like a new startup. It takes different directions, and I think that as the plan evolved to take more of a technology-centric approach, right? DOGE was supposed to be an outside body to the government that was taking a look at a lot of these other constitutional and legal dimensions. I think it became clear that to drive rapid change in some of the ways that we could score quick wins, DOGE came to reside in the government, taking a technology-first approach, taking over what was formerly known as the U.S. Digital Services. At that point, Elon and President Trump and I, we all, came to the same conclusion that for me to drive the vision I had in mind, the best way to do that, the best perch from which to do it, is elected office. And so we all landed at the same place. And I think it was, this past Monday that Elon and I did our first DOGEcast Twitter Spaces, X Spaces. I think we started at midnight. It went to 1:30 a.m., laying out a lot of what this vision was. And if you look at how much he's been able to do in just the first 2 weeks, it's massive. And when you think about a technology-driven approach, nobody better to do it than Elon. And I think he is doing it not in a small way, but in a big way. And I'm going to be as helpful on my front of leading at the state level as is going to be required to pick up the pieces from, tearing up the federal bureaucracy.
How many people are involved with that?
No matter where you're watching Shawn Ryan Show from, if you get anything out of this, please like, comment, subscribe, and most importantly, share this everywhere you possibly can. And if you're feeling extra generous, please leave us a review on Apple and Spotify podcasts.